Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas.
I had my notes for this for when we were first going to do this, and I have my first question, which is, where are we? Why have we been, we've gone through this long journey down into a cave and hopefully back out. And so just, where are we? Where are we in our intellectual journey before we go into 8, 9, and 10? A little perspective would be good. How about Glaucon? What's Glaucon doing?
Oh, we're going to do by characters. Wow.
Oh, gosh. That's the big debate, though, right? What does Glaucon do with this whole book when it's all over? That is the thing, isn't it? Is this talk for Glaucon? I think it is, isn't it?
Not initially, was it?
Well, they would have stopped after Thrasymachus, right?
But he bailed.
He bailed, so they didn't stop. Why didn't they stop? Because two guys weren't satisfied, right?
Yeah. Glaucon and Adamantus both wanted to know why they should be just. And they also thought that by being just, they would be happy. And they have yet to hear somebody make the case to them that would convince them they should, in fact, live that way.
Right. Right. So now that we're here on the precipice of books 8, 9, and 10, where are we in this big project? What was the whole point of the cave? Summarize. The whole point of the cave.
Yeah, the whole point of the cave is to deal with who's a philosopher, what's knowledge, how do you perceive it, and how does the rest of the world interact with it, and how do the philosopher kings need to be able to interact with it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the details of the cave, but why did we go down there? What's the whole point of the story?
We didn't go down there. We started there, Bubba.
Chain there from birth, right?
Yeah.
Right. Fair enough.
I mean, I guess the point is that there is more.
Yeah. Yeah, I like what somebody named Pasquarella says all the time, which is, what is it, that justice is not enough for happiness? Isn't that what you say?
I'm only repeating what Plato and Aristotle say. But yes, that's my bailiwick.
Yeah, that's cool. So go ahead.
So I was going to say just a little bit related to how we ended up at the point talking about philosopher kings. It's helpful to go back to the end of book 4 to see how books 5, 6, and 7 actually go somewhere we weren't expecting. So in book 4, and this is the last page, it's page 125, and the line numbers where this starts is at 445C. This is Socrates who says, now that we've come up to this point in the argument, so this is after they've outlined justice in the soul with the calculating part, using spirit to rein in the desires, Socrates says, now that we've come to this point in the argument, from a lookout, as it were, it looks to me as though there is one form of virtue and an unlimited number for vice, but some 4 among them are also worth mentioning. And how do you mean? This is Glaucon. There are, I said, likely to be as many types of soul as there are types of regime possessing distinct forms. How many is that? Glaucon asks. 5 of regimes, I said, and 5 of soul. And Glaucon asks him, tell me what they are. And so the beginning of book 8, where we turn to the types of regimes and souls, is a natural follow-up to the end of book 4.
Right.
But the interjection in book 5 is, Socrates, you mentioned this thing about men, women, and children holding everything in common. We'd like you to explain that. And so then we get the 3 waves, because Socrates doesn't want to go there, but he does. And so we get the waves of men and women exercising together naked, of them holding everything in common. And then finally, the biggest wave, that philosophers should rule the city, which prompts the ship of state in book 7, and eventually the cave in book ship of state book 6, cave in book 7. So
right.
It's all a digression from the end of book 4, and book 8 picks up where we left off.
Why did we have to digress? Why couldn't we just go from book 4 to book 8? Why do we have to read all that stuff?
He's got to continue to disabuse these people of their preconceived notions.
Okay.
I mean, I think his questions are. I mean, his continual questioning is in order to do that, but sometimes he has to have everybody take a knee and listen to Uncle Socrates tell a story about their preconceived notions and how there might be something more than they at first thought. I think.
Right. I had a Socratic experience with my little boy today. Took them to.
What did he teach you?
Arguments don't work with 7-year-olds. We were at piano lessons, and he wasn't being very good. And I was trying to explain to him that this was the incorrect spot to not be good. That he needed to be quiet, and he didn't. And it didn't matter to him, because he was all emotion and somebody had taken his blocks and he couldn't play with the ones he wanted to play with. It didn't matter where we were. It didn't matter what great pursuits we were. He didn't care about that. So any argument of justice or fairness or whatever, he didn't care about. And so I'm wondering, if you did all of this in book 4, would they have cared about it? Did we have to do some education of these guys in 5, 6, and 7?
Karl, are you saying that they were emotionally hijacked and you had to get them to think about something else first?
I'm saying a 7-year-old's not rational and doesn't love the right things yet. Okay, and these guys.
Can you teach him?
I don't know, but so they interrupted Socrates and said, "We need to talk about sex." Does that sound like? I mean, put that in connection with Cephalus, everyone calls him Cephalus at the very beginning, telling that story of Sophocles, old Sophocles who, I'm happy I'm done with that tyrant. And then go back to in book 9, where the tyrant is dominated by Eros. And I think it all ties together. They were all dominated by Eros. And until Eros is pointed the right direction, it doesn't matter what you talk about. Does that make any sense? If you don't love the right thing, it doesn't matter what you talk about.
So he tells the allegory of the cave to get them to love the right things?
That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it.
I mean, there's certainly a lot of growing stuff in here, right? Like you're talking about. But I mean, I think that the allegory of the cave is a little more on the nose than that. It's like, look.
Oh, sure.
I'm not trying to lead you clowns out of the cave. I mean, are you saying that the cave is their urges?
I'm saying that, okay, so you can have the content, which is living in the shadows and how truth is veiled from us and the requirements of effort and the study geometry. So you can, all of that stuff's good. All of that stuff's wonderful, but its motive in the drama is to get these guys to turn. In other words, the allegory of the cave is to do the same thing that the subjects described in the cave are supposed to do, which is to get them to turn from, groin issues, as you put it, to, like the end of the symposium, like love of the good. So you could still have the details all be really, really good and true, but its function to Glaucon especially is so he doesn't
do what he ended up doing.
Well, he didn't, I don't think, did he? Alcibiades did, but Glaucon we'll have to. Glaucon ends up being one of the 30 tyrants, isn't he?
No,
Mascarella, do you know this?
he's Plato's
Off
brother.
the top of my head, I don't know.
Well,
He's Plato's brother.
He ends up being. I think he ends up confabulating with those guys. He's in bed with them for sure, and I think he ends up losing his life.
Well, we'll have to look that up. I wouldn't want to make claims on that.
Well, somebody will send me an email and tell me what an idiot I am, so that's fine.
Right. So then we get to the end of 7. Are we ready to go to 8 and talk about constitutions?
So my question on the cave is, and this gets to, whenever he's using allegories or metaphors as opposed to dialectics of exploring particulars leading towards a general definition, why does he rely on the metaphors and the analogies, especially when it comes to his biggest ideas? And does that get to what Karl was talking about a little before? Is somehow when it's an allegory, it's not rational anymore, or it's a way of dealing with people who aren't rational? In other words, how do metaphors operate towards the truth as opposed to logical analysis?
Oh, and
This is my big question in dealing with Plato, because it strikes me whenever he really gets to his big points, suddenly we're in an allegory or a story part, and then remembering the whole thing is framed as a story. Right?
well, I
I
mean,
just want to interject a little point to this, and that is,
Yeah.
I think it's ironic that Plato is so against so much art when he's using art.
That's part of my question.
well, I mean, whenever you deal with imagery, with stories, they have inherent order to them. So when you're dealing with a big idea that's abstract and almost dreamlike, you can't express it unless you impose some order on it. You're starting with something that's a little bit more known, and you use the story and the imagery to move towards the unknown. You give them a path to follow to get into the unknown and not be lost.
And I want to tag on to that part of what I think is going on with the known and the unknown is that he's trying to get them to grasp a really abstract idea. And he's giving the metaphors and the analogies are concrete things in life that you're already familiar with. And so you can then make the relationship mentally with the very abstract thing.
Yeah, Socrates is almost always inductive, where he asks people these specific questions. And he wants to apply their answers about these specific things in their lives to some broader concept. He's always trying to go from something they know. Well, let's look at, and in this case, though, he's like, hey, let's look at the state so we can figure out what people are like. So he wants to look at something very, very big so he can see what something smaller is like. He's always trying to set up some sort of a laboratory for understanding these weird, hard to get ideas. He asks people about saddle making to get to something else about teaching, maybe, or he asks them about the state to figure out if a person can be just. He's a weird dude. I just got done reading the 7th letter again. And there's that chunk in there where Plato maybe talks about that he never wants to write down what he knows to be true. And the upshot of it is like, it'll be misunderstood, and that the only way that he can actually really maybe potentially convey that truth to somebody else is through dialectic and through asking these questions and telling these stories probably as well.
You're making me think of show tunes.
Of course, that's what I meant.
Right. So, did you ever see? Of course, you have Camelot. And King Arthur's very, very frustrated. He doesn't know how to deal with his wife, and he's trying to recall what Merlin had told him. All of these, but he wants all the details. Right? Do I flatter her? Do I threaten? Do I whatever cajole or plead? That's how the lyrics go. And then and Merlin just says, you have to love her. In other words, the details won't get you where you want to go on the most important things. But love gets you where you want to go. Scott's making faces. He doesn't believe this.
No, I don't not believe it.
You don't not believe.
I don't not believe it.
Endorsement. Okay, so Aristotle says in Nicomachean Ethics that you don't teach. It doesn't do any good to teach ethics to children.
Although he corrects that very quickly, because he initially says that when it comes to speeches or logos in the political art, the young are not suited because they lack experience. But then immediately after, he says, the problem isn't so much that they lack experience, it's because they have a character that follows passion all the time. Mm. And unless they find a way, and this gets to Marsha's point, to make or produce, so the root word for poesis, poetry, unless they find a way to make or produce their desires according to logos, they will receive no benefit from speeches. So Aristotle says, yeah, age is part of it, but it's much more an issue of character. And this fits what you were saying, Karl, about what did we have to learn from books 5 through 7 that prepare us, and particularly this audience, to make or produce their desires according to reason in a way they could not if we jumped right into the regimes in book 4.
Oh, that's so good. I like the way you put that. Yeah, we have to have our desires be in accord with reason, which is why there's book 10 in this book. Nobody likes to read book 10, but that's why it's
good.
there. Right? That's why you have to banish the poets. Ironically, because Plato himself is a poet. What does poetry do? The poetry, I got a quote somewhere that I wrote down. So this is 607a. If you admit the pleasure-giving muse, pleasure and pain will be kings in your city instead of law, and the thing that everyone has always believed to be best, namely reason.
Well, I think that fits well with the end of Book 5, section 475, where he starts talking about those that are distracted use any excuse to pursue passion instead of reason. The philosopher pursues all knowledge. This is my summary of it. Pursues all knowledge, not just his passion. In pursuit of partial knowledge only resembles a philosopher.
Yeah. Now, is it enough to tell people? With all that being said, is it enough to just tell people you should be rational?
Nor do I
tried-
think you should leave your passions behind. I mean, I'm just not going with his program at all.
Well, I don't think.
I don't think we should carve ourselves up. Or why do we think an abstract idea is superior to the story or the metaphor? Why is this world of dialectical abstractions insulting other people as you go along to prove you're smarter than they are an excellent way to get at the truth of things? And why do we assume that most common people who just sort of think things out in common sense are stupid? This is my problem with going with this program.
Do you think Socrates had that kind of an attitude?
Myself?
Yeah.
I think quite often he does, yeah. I mean, we've all talked about, and who was it that someone complained, I think I was reading, who's the woman at St. John's who teaches? She says, well, all the freshmen at St. John's hate Socrates because he keeps insulting people.
Right.
About their ideas. And it's not till they grow up and learn to appreciate the good stuff, the Socrates, that it's not till they mature into rational people who've left all passion and sense of humor behind.
I think you're being overly harsh.
Of course I am, but it's more fun then.
Makes good pod.
But yes, I'm being overly harsh, but I have to admit, the basic train of logic, I've always had an issue following Socrates' praise of reason over everything else. It just makes no common sense to me.
I think.
And then I don't know how you get at love at all. You're pulling love out of this. Maybe you can help me if you'll explain to me how love and reason are.
Let me explain to you. Okay.
We've got some explaining to do.
You asked yourself, Malachy, at the very beginning, what's the point of the myth? Why, when it gets big, does he always resort to the story? Because the story is the thing that stirs the heart that we love. It doesn't make. This is why they, in my opinion, why they couldn't do constitutions in book 5. They weren't ready. They didn't love the right things. Reason without love is Skynet, from the Terminator. So you got to love the right things, right? The machines are going to kill us all.
Camelot.
So they had to have. I think the whole interlude is about love. I think that ascent out of the cave to the vision of the good, and then the description of the people that have done this, that Glaucon finds so beautiful. So kalos is, I think that's the point of that interlude. You need to love it. Otherwise.
Oh, so it's philos. I mean, it's the love of knowledge. It's just not like, I love people, or, this kind of, you're not having like this mushy, like weird ecumenical love right now, are you, Karl? Or are you talking about the love of wisdom?
Mushy.
What's
Yeah,
what's
love
the
of
verb
wisdom.
here? The philo. How's that? What's the Greek part of that?
Agape instead of
Agape is
That's
like,
different.
is a different kind of thing. Philos.
Yeah, you're talking.
Yeah, love of wisdom.
Yeah, so that
In the
kind of
sense
love.
of friendship.
Friendship.
And I
Thank
think
you.
this is a dominant theme. I think
Philadelphia, that
I
type
mean,
of stuff.
Socrates says in Symposium, the only thing I'm pretty sure of is I'm an expert in love. That whole story in Phaedrus about, the wings of your soul in the presence of the good, it's pretty mystical. And all the stories, if you don't have that, it's.
Yeah, yeah. I dig the mysticism part. I mean, to come out of the cave is, to have some sort of transcendent enlightenment experience, and it probably he is trying to engender a love of wisdom and true knowing in these people and telling that story. And the story is so darn important. If you ask somebody who read The Republic, I don't know, their sophomore year in college or whatever, this is the only part of the thing they're going to remember probably. Is this story. So this is the most enduring. This is the most enduring part of the story, and the reason it endures is because it communicates so much so effectively to people, I think.
Well, the story is essentially any type of story is a means for us to be able to imagine ourselves as a participant, because we learn through action first. The story is the way we can abstract that process. So, I learn more if I walk down the street and trip over the curb. I learn to pick my foot up and not be so stupid when I walk. But if I tell you the story about me walking down the street and not tripping, there's a chance you're going to learn the same lesson without having to make the same mistake.
Yeah. Doesn't everyone who reads the story of the cave be like, yeah, I'm being let out of the cave right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But stories are inherently the way we essentially experience vicariously. So it is the way that the most connection, the most experience is essentially pushed off. Now, when it gets really abstract and really kind of weird, it may not work quite as well. But with the story of the cave being chained down and then ascending into the light, yeah, okay, there's movement to it. You can follow the storyline.
Yeah, and I think it's relatable too. I think most people have some area of expertise where they know something other people don't know.
They had that aha moment of some kind.
Yeah.
Can I ask Karl a question? What love is usually associated more closely with the emotions than with reason. So what does he mean by this?
Well, I suppose we'd have to talk. So a dissertation on Plato's theory of love. Go. And reason. I think so. I think pure reason, there isn't really any such thing. Okay. Pure, like, that's calculation that computers do. But
You mean unmotivated?
values?
Unmotivated reason.
It's not unmotivated. It's hard. The will and the intellect, to talk about it in medieval terms, they're one thing. They're just different sides of one thing. You seek to know that which you love. So I mean, Socrates talks all the time about love.
Karl,
Yeah.
can you love an idea as opposed to a person? I can get that. I know John would be the expert here, but if love is wanting the good for somebody, right? You want them to be as good as they can be, right? If that's what love, and helping them do and be good. I can understand that and even see and go with Socrates on that point, if that's even the point of corrective dialectics. Maybe part of loving somebody is causing a little pain sometime. Where I do get confused on love is, what is love of ideas? Or can you have that? Do you love ideas because they're good, or the true idea is good? Help me.
Help you.
I'm awash in waves.
A related question: why be happy? It's a first principle, right? We just love the good. To try to define it, the good
Wait a
is
minute.
that which fulfills you. We talk about that to go back to the text in book 9, the tyrant has a faulty theory of pleasure. He thinks it's like quenching a thirst when it's actually, or what Socrates asserts is that it's contact with being. It's the fullness of being. And this is a problem. This is not something this is why you have to go in stories. I can't give a syllogism and say, therefore, you ought to desire the good. I just point at it and say, don't you desire that? And if you stand before the form of the good or the unmoved mover or, the highest knowable things, whatever, and you shrug, I don't know what to do with you.
So did you say that the desire to be happy is sort of a first principle?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, seems right.
If you have to explain to somebody, you should want to be happy. Why? Because it'll make you happy,
Right.
I don't know. That's one of those things. My Aquinas is showing, right? You have first being is in the realm of reason, and the good is in the realm of the will, and they're both first principles, and you can't really get behind them.
Well, we do tend to think of people who don't think they should be happy as in a pathological state.
Yeah. Should we talk about constitutions?
Yeah. I actually wanted to go to Malachy's question about the difference between loving persons and loving ideas. I don't know if this is going to come through, but when I look at the regimes, I'll make sure I get this right. I don't know how much that comes through. But what I find interesting about the constitutions, right, we're having this debate, or maybe debate's the wrong word, about images, right? What images are effective? And the cave, I agree, it's a very abstract image. Only certain people will read that and think, I want to love the good. But regimes are a different story. Everybody can see regimes. And there's this beautiful kind of correlation. Each regime has a different type of good that it loves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Socrates is trying to show is that love, that understanding of this is the good, this is what I need to be happy, informs each regime. Of course, building to that kind of revision of what the soul looks like. Right? In book 4, you have these nice, neatly ordered abstractions, calculation, spirit, and desire. At the end of book 9, you have the human being in line for calculation, the lion, which is bigger than the human being, in line for spirit, and then the desires are a many-headed monster. And Socrates says, there's the soul, all those things thrown in together. Right? In other words, the image clarifies just how messy our nature is, but he shows us the good much more clearly than he could before. That's kind of the way into it. Because I think that's the interesting thing about this. We don't tend to think of regimes as ordered towards a good. We think of institutions. And Socrates and Plato show us, no, you've got to think, what's the good that they're trying to advance?
Yeah, everybody seems to, they seem to have good intentions, right? There are all these different political actors are probably all utopians. They're all trying to come up with, except for maybe the nasty tyrant. They're aiming for a better order based on what their drives and their desires are. Does his hierarchy, I don't know, is it a hierarchy? Is his list of these constitutions, is it a hierarchy? Does it represent like a theory of history? Like, is he like, this is how it goes? You're going to go 1, 2, 3.
One leads to this, and then you have this character does this, and it slides into the next form.
He seems to be saying that. Am I right in reading that he says that these constitutions progress into from one to the other? He talks about the father is this type, and then therefore the son is reacts to the father.
This is the part of Plato I loved, which is the whole
thank
father
God.
and son and generations part.
And he doesn't show progress; he shows a regress.
Because sons always want to do the opposite of what their fathers do.
So basically, in 4 generations, you can guarantee all forms of government or tyranny.
Yeah, and it depends. Different philosophers take different lessons from that. Like Machiavelli will look at this regime theory. He'll look at what Aristotle says, and Machiavelli says because it all devolves into tyranny, the regimes don't matter. Whereas Plato and Aristotle emphasize, no, you need to understand these are distinct regimes. And I'd push back a little on Scott reading it as a version of history. Like history, that's much more Hegelian, right? Bad German philosophy. That's a much later idea.
You smuggled some shit in there, Bubba.
For Plato, right? It's bound to the nature of things. The love of wisdom somehow corrupts into a love of honor. So it's close to wisdom, but it's not quite there. The love of honor eventually corrupts into a love of money, and then you get oligarchy. Oligarchy corrupts love of money into a love of freedom, and then love of freedom corrupts into a love of desire. If you can ascend, right? You can descend or ascend, but it's all from the descent is from wisdom, the most permanent and enduring of goods sown into the nature of things, to the disordered desires at the bottom of each of us. And that revised image at the end of book 9 is it's all mixed in together in human nature. We are not these neat little boxes where you could cut out the part with reason, the part without reason, and figure us out. And you have to order things properly according to nature. Otherwise, it all goes wrong.
I like that I think it's interesting that it's there's a perfect form, and then there's deviations from there's the most perfect form, and then there's deviations from it. So if it is at all historical or speculative history, it's not progress. There's no such thing as progress.
What's the opposite of progress?
Stasis.
Congress.
Regress.
Cyclical.
Yeah. That's why it's Hegelian.
It is Hegelian. I mean, there's a whole lot of ways around it.
We tend to think, we silly modern people tend to think that if we just add time and our good intentions, we're going to progress. It's nobody ever asks what we're progressing towards. But just, it's like an infinite number of monkeys. If you give them an infinite number of typewriters and a whole lot of bananas, they write Shakespeare.
But according to Plato, we progress towards tyranny.
But
you can.
But then he says the only way you can fix that is basically end up with a civil war and go back.
Well, love of wisdom gets you there.
Right. If we had more philosophers, and I don't mean academic philosophers. I mean,
but he says the philosophers won't take the job unless they're starting with a clean slate.
Yeah.
Well, we have to compel everybody to do these things.
Well, okay, so this is bumping into the question: is this practical statecraft, practical statesmanship, or is it about the soul? And I tend to think it's about the soul, and so I don't get hung up on the little cruelties that you have to do to make this thing work in action.
Well, this goes back to our last conversations. Is this prescriptive, practical, or is this a thought exercise? And he says at every turn in the road, well, I may be wrong. This may not really work in real practice, but the value of the exercise is to look at what the ideals are to see what we should be striving toward. So even if I'm wrong about all this, it's still a worthwhile exercise.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you get out of it at the end? At the end of book 10, what do you get?
Christianity.
Why do you say that, Marsha?
Because some of the main features of Christianity are described in that chapter.
You can't just say that. You have to
Yeah, that's a big one.
Well, couldn't you say it's kind of the origin of Neoplatonism with the theory of immortality, which is then adopted? A lot of it's adopted by Christians.
Your objectivism is showing.
Well, for one thing, it's the theory of immortality and the idea that the things of this earth are imperfect, and what you need to do is, I'm talking about medieval Christianity, what you need to do is look to heaven and have your sights on heaven in order to live well, and not be concerned with the body, but be concerned with the abstract, the good, which are all the perfect forms. Those are a few of the things that made me think of that.
Yeah,
Marsha, can I build a question around that to the other experts in the group? So is it that the ideas are abstract, or that, as I recall, there's also a theory of memory here, that maybe abstraction isn't the way to the ideas, but it's somehow evoking the memories of heaven, where we came from? That inside, or the whole theory that all of us are basically good to start out with because we come from the good.
And I'm trying to remember the part, but he describes how those people who have not lived well are sent to a hell.
Yeah, there's a
He even describes how there's a purgatory. He doesn't use that word, but there's a waypoint in which you can get rid of the parts of you that were bad, and then you can go on to getting to the heaven.
You got the feeling Dante read this part.
I think so.
Yeah. Karl's just rubbing his beard.
A somewhat Weasley Aristotelian response to Marsha's observation, because I think on the one hand that's true, and on the other hand it's not. So at the end of Book 9, this is at 592a, and so this is where Socrates is describing the life of the man with intelligence, and maintaining order within himself. And then I think this is Glaucon who says, this is right under 592a, if it's that he cares about, right, so certain types of honors in public and private life, he won't be willing to mind the political things. And Socrates says, yes, by the dog, he will in his own city very much so. However, perhaps he won't in his fatherland unless some divine chance coincidentally comes to pass. I understand, he said. You mean he will in the city whose foundation we have now gone through, the one that has its place in speeches, since I don't suppose it exists anywhere on earth. But in heaven, so this definitely fits Marsha's point, perhaps a pattern is laid up for the man who wants to see and found a city within himself on the basis of what he sees. It doesn't make any difference whether it is or will be somewhere, for he would mind the things of this city alone and of no other. So that fits Karl's point that it's about the soul. But I don't think he means it in a supernatural sense. There is some other realm we're trying to get to, right? Certainly, I mean, you have the dialogue from Plato on the Symposium, right? Don't discount the body, love the wine, let the speeches flow, right? Where this exists, the only eternal place where this city exists, it's not in the regimes outside of us, it is in logos, in speech. The pattern, we leave it to speech to preserve the truth. Right? Like, if anywhere there's a case for freedom of speech, which is ironic, given we have this work that talks about censoring the poets, Socrates in the end says it's speech that leaves us open to the best life, into the good. That's where you'll find the just. That's where you'll find the city. Whether or not it comes to be in the place you live, you never know. But speech is where you know it can be preserved.
I got chills. Yeah. May I add? If you look at the end of the myth in Book 10, where you meet Odysseus, there's all sorts of people who are going through and picking their next life. And
maybe we should, for our listeners, we should tell them a little more about Book 10.
The myth
what the myth is.
Oh, the myth of Ur, it's a near-death experience, and a guy gets a vision of the afterlife, and then gets sent back to tell people about it. And he sees kind of the divine sorting house, like in Hogwarts. Everyone's getting sorted, but the theory is that you come back, but you get to pick a different life depending on how you lived. And so everybody's making choices. So Ajax didn't want to be a human anymore because he was mad. Agamemnon wanted to be an eagle. Atalanta chose to be a male because, she was an athlete and she couldn't live appropriately as a female. But then we get Odysseus. Thersites becomes a monkey. That's kind of funny.
Yeah.
This is 620C and following. Now it chanced that the soul of Odysseus got to make its choice last of all. And since memory of its former sufferings had relieved it of its love of honor, it went around for a long time looking for the life of a private individual who did his own work, and with difficulty found one lying off somewhere neglected by others. So in the garbage heap, there's this private life. He chose it gladly and said that he'd have made the same choice even if he'd been first. And this is the last guy that's described as picking a life. And the one that he picks is a private, non-political, quiet life, not a love of honor, which connects, I think, directly with John's quote about the city in speech, the city in the heavens that you model your life on. But it's not probably going to be a political life in your town.
So, okay, I don't know if this is the proper place to bring this up, but it gets to the end of the story. But what launches all this is not quite the question. It's sort of after the launch. The question becomes, what is justice?
Yeah.
Out of all that in book 10, where does justice get answered and all that? Because it's practicing justice with reason in every way is part of the last paragraph. And I look at that and it's just mealy mouth gobbledygook. Because I have this undying thought that the word we're being given for justice is terribly translated as justice. And I think we're missing the entire point with the translation of justice.
What does our translator, Johnny P., say?
Dikaiosune is the Greek word for justice. In the New Testament...
There's got to be more to it than that.
In the New Testament, it means righteousness. There is a difference between the just as a principle and justice, right? Justice, dikaiosune, is about the soul, right? Literally, it means with the just, right? So it's some type of ordering with the just. The translation's right. But to actually get to your point, at 620C, where Karl had read, right, the life of a private man who minds his own business. In book 4, when Socrates defines justice in the soul, it's each part minding its own business.
Yeah.
So it carries through.
But there's the problem that I have with all of this is, I mean, I dug around on this because I even that, to put it gently, I'm not quite buying. And what I did is I went and looked at Glaucon from University of Chicago, and it said there's a more antiquated definition that was essentially well-ordered, following the wills of the gods, essentially with a religious overtone to it that eventually morphed into this idea of legalities. And I think what really gets me in all this in terms of translation is the false idea that one word in one language is exactly translated into another. It ain't.
No, but the way you describe the different definitions, and that's the whole dispute in the Euthyphro. It's the Euthyphro says he cares about the pious, but it turns out he actually cares more about the just. I think both of these meanings are true, right? And I think why you might be dissatisfied with it, but I think this is what Plato and Aristotle recognize, right? And I'll just go back because I'm a broken record on this. Justice is not everything, but the various meanings associated with the term shows you how much we've invested in it. And Plato and Socrates in particular comes around, right? Glaucon and Adeimantus want to be happy. They think being just will make them happy. And Socrates says, no, knowing the good will make you happy. Wisdom will make you happy. The thing you're looking for, you're missing, but it's right there in front of your face if you just push a little further and ask yourself, what is justice to begin with? I think they're so good, these philosophers, at getting at these terms that everybody uses colloquially and showing what's buried underneath them.
But see, that's where I say I think the English translation, it is inadequate. The English word of justice rarely has survived with a religious overtone to it. It
Now,
is.
is this a language problem, or perhaps a
Well, it's a language problem that I think
a theory of justice problem?
Well, I think one leads to the other.
For our listeners out there, Mr. Heck is an attorney.
But, you think about, if we just use the English word justice as if it's interchangeable here and not recognize that justice in our vernacular doesn't have the same ring, overtone, any of the religious aspect to it. And the irony of it is, in our history, there have been times where we keep coming back and challenging it. The classic case, if you want some great movies with Peter O'Toole, Henry II and Thomas à Becket are both great movies from the early 60s, I believe. But, it tells an actual story where King Henry II appoints his best friend, Thomas à Becket, as the first. He was his chancellor, essentially at that time, the prime minister. And, here he is, a priest of the Catholic Church and serving as more or less the prime minister, partially because he could read and write. So it was really good to have somebody who could read and write be in charge of your government as you're running around France fighting wars, and having this guy back in England and making sure T's are crossed and I's are dotted. But then he says, I'm going to get in a fight with Rome. So he moves him over to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. And then he ends up fighting with him over church doctrine. But in between all that, the chancellor was given legal authority it become very, very important in English legal history, because they were having all these law cases decided. This is, for the plaintiff, this is for defendant. But people are coming out and saying these are unfair results. And so Henry II appointed Thomas à Becket to say, you are to decide these cases based on what is equitable. What is fair?
I think you're making Pascarella and maybe Plato's point is that
what
the justice is doesn't matter.
But then we end up abstracting, we get back into these legalities. So these things all come back in English, but the problem in all of it is we don't carry around the idea of justice in the American vernacular with this religious overtone to it. And I think by not having that religious overtone that Plato fully meant, we're missing a good part of what he's saying, because this thing starts with Cephalus saying, well, I'm going to go off and make sacrifices so I can make sure my soul is right with the gods. And we come back to the end of it and we're trying to deal with the gods. And I think if we're not dealing with that religious aspect of it, we're missing the start and the end of the book.
Two things. I mean, the context does bring the religious aspect, but I also want to add to your point about the equitable. Both Plato and Aristotle point to an idea that is associated with the just that's beyond it. It's Greek is epieikeia. It's either translated as the decent or the equitable, but it's a one-for-one correlation with how we understand the idea today. But that's the point. And even Aristotle, various times he'll say, I don't have a word to describe this. Right? There's a love of honor that there's not a name for. Right? That even speech has limits, but I think you have to acknowledge any translation, you're going to cut those things out. But I think the context is there to tell you, right? The fact that it is to the divine that the just comes up shows Plato's recognition of where people think the just is.
But I think there's even more to it, because if the religious connotation has more a sense of following the order of the gods, then this whole process of moving from looking at an individual's soul and what's well-ordered within his soul is much easier to follow if you're looking at a well-ordered society. And if you don't include that as part of the analysis, because we look at well order and justice from an American standpoint. It's, is there a procedure that's in place so you can end up with a predictable result? And that's not what this notion of justice is.
That's why you read the text, though. It's to liberate you from your current standpoint.
Well, but what I'd say is, with a less emphasis on this artificial one-to-one relationship with the Greek word and the English word, I think you end up with a better read of it.
Well, I still think you're making his point. Like your love of wisdom is what causes all of your friction around the problems of translation, perhaps, and these different notions of justice. And I don't think that we can actually figure out what justice is. I don't think it can even be done. And if you have that love of wisdom, then maybe you can approach it as an asymptote. You could see the thing that's most important. You can mind your own business, and like the character Odysseus picks at the end of the story. But without the love of wisdom, you can't find justice anyway. You can't even. You don't even have a hope of it. No.
I mean, to me, this reads much more. If
Karl
you
has to go.
translate it as what is discipline, what is a well-ordered soul, what is a well-ordered city.
Can I build a question off of that?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking when we talk about justice, we've been talking about goodness, wisdom, and reason as sort of dominant themes in this, right? For the beginning here, as divine, does the concept of proportion come in at all? I think before we get to the cave, we have the divided line. Isn't reason come off the word ratio or
Rationality,
which are proportions, right? Is reason the act of proportioning, and is wisdom the act of proportionate thinking? And that, so it's not so much particulars versus universals is what makes things reasonable or define them, but are we defining things proportionately? What I also like about the concept of proportions is it also then enables us to talk about stories. So I'm using proportion, Jeff, for your sense of order. And isn't that also part of the analogy of the state of which I was talking about earlier? We have all these conflicting forces within us, or seem to be, within the state, within the human being. And the art of living is the art of finding the right proportion, or the wisdom to achieve the good, and the good is the right proportion. Am I totally off kind of using proportion as an idea into these things? Or that's kind of how I tie them together in my own mind.
To back up Jeff's point from a different angle, this is the limit in trying to translate logos.
Yeah.
Right? The calculating part of the soul, it's logismos. So it has logos at its roots, and it can mean reasoning with regards to ideas. It could mean reasoning with regards to mathematics. But right, logos also means word. It means the rational account of the whole. All of those things are present. And you see this more in Aristotle's Ethics, right? He tries to separate these different types of thinking out, right? There's comprehension, there's wisdom, there's prudence. But at bottom is the intellect, and the intellect is thrown in with desire. In that respect, it doesn't sound much different than what Plato shows us in Book 9. Right? So all of these things are there. It's that all-encompassing. But it's all the sign of one work. By one work I mean intellect, contemplation. These are all contemplation. There's some source for it. It just manifests itself in different ways.
Well, our quorum has broken up. Marsha had to go pick up her husband so he didn't have to go walk in the winter storm from the train. And Karl had to go pick up his kids from ballet so they didn't have to walk in the winter storm because they're in Chicago and it's 37 degrees below Kelvin. And high winds.
I had a guy in my group last night who was from Minnesota, and he said they were expecting the coldest temperature ever tomorrow.
Yeah, it's not good. Yeah, because today it's January 29th. We could probably talk about this for hours and hours and still not know anything about it, but that's why I love it. It's made us talk about, well, maybe the origins of Christianity, justice, theory of history, and we've touched a whole bunch of stuff today, and it was interesting. Thanks, gentlemen, and thanks to the gentleman and the gentle lady that have already left, Marsha and Karl.
Okay, we'll see you. I'll tune out.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Jeff.